Hello and welcome to the Dingometer with myself, Tony Reeves. The Dingometer is a podcast where we talk about the factors that produce awesome learning experiences through learning design, and we come at this from multiple perspectives. And I'm absolutely delighted to have with me today my guest, Dr. Tim Savage, PFHEA. Tim has worked for over 25 years in creative arts education and held a range of posts, but more recently head of academic development planning and director of technical learning. Tim's an absolute expert in the role of technical services in creative arts education, but his expertise extends way beyond that. Recently got principal fellowship and also PhD looking at the role of technical curriculum and technical pedagogies. So Tim, absolute pleasure to have you on the podcast today.
Oh, thank you. Thanks. Good to be here, Tony.
So this is always a tricky question because you recently undertook a huge piece of research into the role of technicians in higher education, and we could talk about that for probably about 6 hours. So I'm going to try and pull out some of the key insights from that. But there's so many useful things that came out of that study, both from, I suppose, for individual technicians working in higher ed roles, but also at a much more strategic level in terms of how technicians and the technical function is positioned within a higher education context. So there's a lot to unpack, but firstly, I just want to start, what was it that led you then to commit yourself to undertaking this doctoral research? Because it was a huge project. So why were you interested in the role of the technician's role in higher education?
Well, I suppose I didn't instantly think I'd do a doctorate in something as obscure as the way technicians teach and support learning. It came from a long way back, and I think if I take it, I'll skip the first 2 decades or so of my life and go to my undergraduate study, which was in photography. Photography is a technical practice. You need equipment, you need knowledge of physics, of conventions, of chemistry, or at least you did when I did it in 1995. And I suppose I experienced my instruction, my teaching differently in that I had a very different academic team to a technical team, and they really didn't gel, whereas the knowledge that I would take from each, I suppose, job family, if you like, the conceptual elements, the criticality, the theory that I gained from the academics was held in really high esteem. It was in the assessment criteria, whereas for me, I was much more of a technical, a practical. My thinking was done with my hands through my processes, and I enjoyed what I could make. I wasn't as good as others about talking about what I made or theorizing it or contextualizing it in Foucault's framework and things like that. But I suppose I very quickly found that I leaned towards that practical making. A number of other students did, and I found a dissonance in the course. My career evolved when I graduated. Those skills that weren't held in such high regard in university were suddenly very important on the outside when I was being paid to make things and work commercially. But I came back to HE as a technician, and I suppose I tried, without really realizing it, to reconcile the idea of thinking through making, experimentation, to expand my practice and to kind of close down, I suppose, what I felt very much was a them and us between the academic and the technical. Then I progressed through various different roles. I had a very supportive employer, which I was promoted many times, and there was space to grow and opportunities to reload, to use that learning. I became a manager of technicians, which meant I was then managing people's pedagogies, which sat outside my photographic competence. I was then a director of a technical services team, which I rebranded as technical learning in light of the contribution to learning, teaching. And I suppose all the time I was finding this dissonance and a disparity of esteem around what it was that the technicians were doing and the impact on students, and how that's a hugely important part of education wasn't being reflected in the strategies, in the quality assurance, quality enhancement. There were developmental opportunities that weren't there, and there was an opportunity, I suppose, and I very much wanted to shine a light on what I felt was a really important aspect of the student experience and the staff experience, so that it could be drawn out into the light, so it could be examined, theorized, so that it could be quantified, improved, and hopefully, so everybody who does a PhD would like it to have some impact in the world, is for it to be something that can turn into an actionable strategy, so that things can be costed, quality assured, and some of those things that are taken for granted or exist in what you might some call a hidden curriculum are brought out into the light, because we don't need a hidden curriculum. We need a curriculum that that we can understand and test and evolve and collaborate on. And then, of course, through that journey, I did a PG cert, which was absolutely transformative. I would absolutely recommend that to people, early career technicians, or even, people don't have to be early career, people who find themselves being drawn in that direction, where I found the first of the theories, I suppose, that I was really able to begin to contextualize practice in, which was Celia Whitchurch's Third Space, which I know was the title of up here. So that's part of why I'm referencing it. Whitchurch theorized the kind of dissolving binary of the academic and technical job families, and her work gave me a space in which I could begin to develop theory, which I did on my PG cert, but it wasn't really until my MA creative education course that I was able to really mature those theories to publish. And I think now, having done so, that then introduced me to doctoral research, because I became a kind of researcher informally, and the articles gave me these kind of, I suppose, academic credentials and skills. So it felt like there was knowledge to be found and a path to be travelled, I suppose. And the doctorate gave me the opportunity to evolve that thinking, and around the third space really transcend it, because there are problems with the third space insofar as, if you're a technician, the third space really describes academic and professional support, but it regards professional support becoming more blended, where staff might have academic credentials, they might begin to influence academic practice and learning and teaching, but technicians really just camp right in that space, because they are literally delivering the learning and teaching, the core hours that comprise the curriculum. So I don't think they are necessarily in the third space. I think they're doing, in the learning and teaching space, very often an academic job, but with a technical hat on. And that then plays to my final answer to this question, Tony, which is, the title of my thesis was Teaching to the Line. And that is because for a long time in my early career, technicians would teach to a point, I can't really teach you any more of that because it's going to change how the work looks, or we're getting into your thoughts, and actually I'm here to teach you your practice. And I think that what my thesis really discovered, or one of the things it discovered, was there is no line. In terms of practice-based teaching, if academic staff member and a technical staff member both chose to teach something, I know software is an easy example, but a process, then if a viewer were looking through the window at these two different rooms with it going on, or even sat in a seat being taught, how would they experience it so differently? Where is the line? And spoiler alert, there isn't really one. So there you go.
Crikey. Thanks, Tim. Yeah, just so loads to unpack in there, but it's interesting that, I suppose, like any good piece of research, this was the culmination of, let's say 20, 25 years worth of you having that experience, starting off as a technician, coming in, experiencing some of these barriers firsthand, this whole sort of them and us, glass ceiling, whatever you want to call it. And certainly when I did the same PG cert course that you ended up doing, and then I found it fascinating because I was coming from a different perspective, sort of becoming aware of this this line, this barrier, and sort of then, but not really understanding it, and why technicians could only progress so far, or why some of them had to struggle to get funding to come on these courses, and like you say, why there was this lack of visibility, and it became evident that there was a whole dynamic around this that people didn't really know how to talk about. It was just how it was, and yet, as you say, so importantly, technicians were often the first line of defense. They were often doing more teaching, or certainly more student contact with the students, and yet they were prevented from doing certain things around assessment. So there was clearly a really sort of complex nested problem in here, and you started to sort of allude to some of the things you found out. But what were some of the main findings then that you found out through your research? Where did it take you, and sort of what were some of the big conclusions that you found out through this investigation?
Well, it was a real journey. I did mine through COVID, which was particularly problematic. Homeschooling was the hardest part. I think, hence the acknowledgements in my thesis is all about the family support and being patient. But in terms of the knowledge of the research, I suppose there was already a kind of gap in knowledge that was fairly well documented. I mean, people would know it anecdotally as they work in our institutions, but I suppose Deering had first conceived of a blurring of the boundaries between academic and technical pedagogies back in '97. I was fortunate in my experience that I was invited to join the Research England funded Talent Commission, which was just fantastic. For if you're a doctoral student, and then there's a national commission on your area of interest that gets organised and you're part of it. It's an absolute gift. And I suppose what that gave me in the largest study of technicians conducted was clarity that the creative arts was an outlier in respect of, yes, technicians were becoming more deeply involved in learning and teaching across the wider sector, but nowhere more so in the arts, not just in scale, but in the complexity of what it is that technicians are called to do. Whether it's not just, background support, well, that's valid. It's reactive support to students, but at the sharper end, around I think 45% of technicians who responded, which is about 10% of the whole sample of people who worked in HE and technical contracts, were involved in delivering core units and contributing to assessment and design in the curricula. So it's a real creative arts standout from talent. I used some of that data to inform my own research questioning, which was really with the scale of the I'm going to say a problem, but with the scale of technical teaching cut out through National Policy Commission and with the policy trail, my research was to really get inside what happens in that space, to understand what is it about. Well, what is technical teaching? How's it conceived of? What is it that people do? And my research question was, how do visual arts technicians conceive of their pedagogies? But the way in which that was responded to was through three separate questions, which was, well, what is it that technicians teach? How is it they teach it? And why do they teach it anyway? What is it that drives those pedagogies? I suppose the headline outcome from the research was a taxonomy of technical teaching, which showed that there's a spectrum, very similar to a lot of the studies that have been carried out on academic teachers, actually. And I think that really speaks again to the point about, the line where that is and how is it so different in terms of practice-based teaching as to the contract status of the person delivering it. In that there's a spectrum between a kind of teacher-centered, subject-orientated, which would be absolutely vital and very important to people being inducted into new, potentially high-risk equipment. There's a very, I suppose, convergent pedagogy at one end of the spectrum, for good reason. It's valid, and everybody takes their first steps as a novice, and learning the conventions is an important part. But at the other end, there is a kind of more student-centered and transformation-orientated. Now, it's not a sort of a binary. There's a whole sequence of mindsets in the way that the technicians conceive of their pedagogies through what it is they teach, how they do it, and why they do it, that is a tool set that I hope that people will be able to relate to. And I think everybody will be able to understand that teacher-centered, content-orientated in a technical session, because when you're in, first experience of things, that's very much what it is. You get a kind of flat pack experience of, look, we're going to do this today. I'm going to do it. You're going to copy me. I'm going to check you can do it the way I do it. And if you do it appropriately and competently and you don't hurt yourself and you don't break the equipment, then I've done my job. I mean, that, there's a validity to that. But the levels of knowledge and practice I discovered were just vast in terms of the way people were teaching through the tools. The tools became less of the focus of the teaching. It was the way in which they informed ideas. I saw and heard of examples where technicians had designed escape rooms where problems had to be solved, where it wasn't about giving the student solution. It was about posing the scenario where there was no solution necessarily. And it was about using the different resources in different ways and thinking about the outcomes and the viewer experience and the knowledge embedded in the artifact or the outcome rather than the tools. And I suppose they were really interesting to me. And I suppose what I'd like in terms of the knowledge that came out is for people whose pedagogies are perhaps focused more at the content and teacher centered, to understand that there are different, more sophisticated ways of delivering technical teaching, and to interpret, I suppose, through timetable teaching, what is the need? How can I position myself on this spectrum to give as much autonomy, support, space, rather than be divergent, where, convergent, where I've done it, you copy me, job done. But understanding, I suppose, how these pedagogies are deployed and the value, and I suppose questioning the right level of lesson planning or the reactive support given to the student who comes to you with the problem. How do you triage that? How do you then design the experience? Because another finding was that the technicians generally have a great deal of autonomy in what happens. They are given a block of time and a subject teach 3 hours a week on Photoshop for 10 weeks. And actually there's a whole curriculum that gets built inside that, which has its own problems of constructive alignment. And also if that technician leaves your institution, half the curriculum goes with them if it's not part of the actual written, clear, integrated curriculum. So they were the big headlines, but I suppose another one was that technicians felt so unconfident, if that's a word, to state what their practices were teaching. There was a real, I suppose, clear paradox where universities are very reliant on the teaching of technicians, but they sustain cultures and systems that make it difficult for people to say they teach, because teaching is regarded very often as exclusively academic. So for a technician to say that, it kind of just treads on toes, or it puts head just a little bit place. And I suppose being able to explore that and unpack the definition of teaching. And I think in the healthiest of institutions I've worked with, there is, that word is not so emotive. It's different kinds of teaching. Absolutely there are. But I think we don't need to get hung up on that word. But it was a big thing, certainly through my career. If you said you taught as a technician, you were kind of wandering into spaces that very often would cause some pushback. So that was an interesting thing. And I wrote an article with Kelly Veer that it speculated perhaps what some of the reasons behind that. So yeah, they were the main headlines, I suppose. The taxonomy of technical teaching, the paradox where technical teaching is so important and vital, but systems and processes don't always pick them up.
It's so interesting because it's you sort of alluded to it there. Your study really got to the heart of what teaching is, and I suppose the approach you took was about that. As like how do technicians conceive of their pedagogies and how their teaching, but also more broadly at an institutional level, there was some quite interesting sort of structural issues there around who gets to say what teaching is. Like, why is that teaching and that not teaching? When there's a more knowledgeable other having a conversation with a less knowledgeable person, and some kind of development is happening. So how do you draw the line as to whether that's teaching or not? So there was some really, it got really to the heart of some of those key issues around what do we mean by teaching, what do we mean by pedagogy. And I want to come on in a moment to some of the implications of this for universities, particularly at a strategic level, and the risks of not dealing with this. But just before we get onto that, you've done a big piece of research, but you've also worked at a senior level, looking at, obviously managing technical teams, but looking at how to coordinate resources within a higher education institution. So what are some of the other structural issues that you encountered through your work, so not just through your research, regarding the sort of the technical and academic provision? What do some of those barriers look like to, I suppose, to progression, but also to delivering student experience, to curriculum development, to timetabling? What were some of those other kind of key areas that you thought this is a big problem?
Well, I suppose culture is a big one. I mean, my career history is broadly based at UCA, University of Creative Arts, but through the course of my study, I visited 7 other centres across the United Kingdom, multi-faculty, small and specialist, large monotechnics. I had a good sight. So I suppose what I'm not doing is reflecting exclusively on my time at UCA, because a lot of the trends I observed played out in all areas in some form or another. And actually, subsequently, after graduation, I was fortunate to take a knowledge exchange trip to the US and found many of the traits that I discovered in the UK were absolutely playing out at MIT and Rhode Island School of Design. And that sort of this kind of collective awakening, I suppose, and I'll come on to this a little bit when we talk about some of the bigger issues, but the kind of professionalization of the technical family and the value is basically, it's evident. Look out the window, go and read some politics, and what's all the language about in education these days. But in terms of the structure of the culture, I think technicians are very often seen as a threat rather than an asset. And that wasn't exclusively everywhere. There were some institutions that were far more open, would involve technical staff in learning and teaching activities, whether that was the revalidation of courses, it was academic, be involved in academic governance, whether that was external examiners, rewriting units. It was about ensuring that the learning outcomes that ultimately students will work towards for the assessment criteria were informed through the kind of what would be taught in the studios and workshops, that constructive alignment piece, which is so important. Because not having that, what are you assessing at the end? If you're the assessor, if you've introduced the unit and you've done tutorials of the work in practice, and then you turn up at the end, you may not necessarily be connected to the learning that's then manifest, particularly in new technology subjects where that's so much more kind of emerging and continually evolving, which is very hard to keep track of, whether you're a technician, an academic, or anybody. So I think, culture being seen as a threat rather than an asset. I think policy, inclusion in policy, is another structural issue. I think a good example would be things like your learning and teaching strategies, pedagogic development. I was very fortunate to be supported to study a PG Cert. So I mentioned earlier, this was massive for me, really set me on my path. That's less prevalent now in some institutions. I think not having a strategic technical lead is also very important. Where these exist, and I know UKRI sponsored a report, I think Nottingham and Liverpool did it, about the value, and apologies if somebody else did and I've forgotten them, but the value of strategic technical leads, having a voice of what is a huge element of the workforce. I mean, just take UCA, over 100 people sat there contributing to the student experience. So for the various committees, whether they be health and safety, which you'd expect, but there's the education committee, there's capital investment groups, there's course planning, course quality, learning and teaching, to have that scale of the workforce connected, not just with the voice upwards, but with the voice downwards, and to know that they're connected. I suppose if that's not there, the risks are the perspectives will be, I suppose, vicariously presented inauthentically, and we can assume that our technical teams are connected to the institutional KPIs, but without that voice at the table, that's not always the case. So I suppose in terms of structural issues and barriers, visibility, culture, where you recognize the value and you nurture it and you include. Another example would be the workload allocation model. For example, I know of numerous institutions that have implemented a WAM, and it's implemented for the academic teams, and there's a kind of notional, we'll install it for the technicians in a phase 2, and I know of at least 3 institutions that haven't yet planned their phase 2. And I suppose from my knowledge of technician practice and the potential loading on teaching hours, I can point a flag at people who are teaching in excess of 30 hours a week who absolutely need the workload allocation model, because without that, if you're teaching such high volume and it's not accounted for and it's not quality assured and it's not explicit in the curriculum, not only are you contributing to you're doing a piece of work that is broadly outside of your responsibility, or at least a scale, but you are not then able to do the things you are there for, that you get judged on, be they ensuring that your equipment works, that your spaces are safe and tidy. In fact, one of the things that came out of the doctoral research actually was a framework of activity which was enabling, supporting and delivering learning, and a lot of the research is about support and delivering, but actually that enablement, that think of Maslow, think of the base. We need our spaces to be accessible, to be welcoming, to be safe and inspiring. And if the person whose job it is to ensure that is happening is spending 6/7 of their time delivering it, not only is it difficult for the spaces, it means that those students who need the support from that person, who have been are able to work, they don't get that in that practice.
That's interesting. So and a lot of that, you've highlighted three key areas. There's a culture, policy, and strategy. So there were barriers in all of those, and quite different barriers. But amazing to hear that technicians were seen perhaps more of a threat than an asset. That's just a revelation. But also, like you say, lack of representation in policies, key policies, not getting funding for support, and then not being visible or not being connected into the wider strategy through lack of a technical lead. So you can see why there is that disconnect then, if there is that lack of representation. And so I suppose this leads us on to then some of the bigger issues then, because there's a big question then. You've done a piece of research, you found out a lot of stuff around these barriers, but also around some of the reasons why this matters, not just to individuals but to universities. So what is the value to universities? Why should universities consider rethinking the role of technical higher education? Higher education's in a moment of quite significant change at the moment anyway, and everything's necessarily up for grabs, but there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of up in the air, there's a lot of rethinking what the core business of higher education is. And I think in that there is scope for discussions around the strategic value of all sorts of activities, not just technical, but the strategic value of teaching and research, and what do all these things mean, and how does that come into the broader remit of the university. So in your opinion, so what is the strategic value of reconsidering the role of technical education, but also what are the risks of not doing it, I suppose, is also just as important.
No, they're good questions, and I suppose higher education has never been more volatile than it is right now. And also the resource, it's a diminishing resource for all kinds of different reasons. I mean, the pest factors, political, economic, social, and technological, have been, it's a perfect storm almost. But I won't use time on that. I think we all know that. But I suppose strategic values and risks. Values, I suppose, I mean, I mentioned earlier, just kind of, read the newspaper, dial into the news, see what the political landscape is for HE. Now, while technical might not have such, I suppose, it may be not held in the same level of esteem as perhaps some of the scholarship and knowledge and research that we might associate with universities and academia. Well, technical education is, look in the manifestos, the idea of skills, the formation of Skills England, E-levels, higher technical education. I think skills, I mean, somebody I referenced talked about a competency turn in HE, where the emphasis has shifted from what students know to what they can do. And I think skills aren't just about being able to use technical equipment. Skills are a much broader set of attributes and competencies, along with techniques. But I suppose if we look at the big headline mission of what university, certainly for me, everyone's got their own mission. I'm not the one to dictate that. But there are some commonalities, and that applicants to HE now are seeking value for money. In our particular area, well, I say our area, are you still creative arts, Tony? I'm sort of
from that kind of creative arts background,
practice-based subject, shall we say, across the disciplines, and there is some commonality. Motion capture in animation is not too different from motion capture in sports science. From my limited experience, so if anyone disagrees, I could be wrong, but from the way it's taught and learned, it seems very similar. So the applicants to our courses, that when our marketing teams go out and they what are we going to do? Well, of course, it needs to be transformational. These are ontological experiences. They need I need to be something else. And what they want to transform into in the main is practitioners. Very often arts education of 20 years ago we'd all been contemporary artists, but actually the creative economy is diversified so much, and it's a tangible outcome. Employability has become more of a focus than ever before. So I suppose applicants want courses that can transform them into practitioners, and students want to be taught the relevant skills to expand their practice. The experience I had was as an undergraduate photography student in the kind of late 90s was that I didn't have that available to me in the curriculum. They had to be sought out. Graduates, understandably, want to be employable. Which very often, yes, it's about being able to present yourself in particular ways, think in ways, the aptitudes, resilience, all those soft skills, hard skills, technical skills, valued in a bundle. We aren't divided that one half of us is technical and the other half is academic. We are continually oscillating, and that's one of the points I make in the thesis, really, about thinking and making being an oscillation of inner and outer selves. But employers too, they want graduates that come with that not just have some abilities and knowledge of the field in which they're going to emerge into, but the ability to be, I suppose, metacognitive, the ability to know how they learn, to understand their own learning, and to be able to adapt through new equipment and new technologies, and obviously a very transformative one in AI that's emerged in the last kind of 18 months specifically. So I think that's the loop. It's attracting people with why this would transform them, giving them an experience in which that they do have access to that, should that be their driver, and in a way that they can have a better life after the experience at university. And for many, that's employment prospects. It doesn't have to be, but if you don't feel that you've been transformed, part of your transformation shouldn't just be thinking about your practice. It should be actually being able to practice. And in terms of risks for institution, I would say there's absolutely existential. Financial risk is huge. metrics hurt institutions, and those students that don't get the experience they're expecting, those graduates that don't find employment, they will hurt the institutions on the way out. We've seen that across a number of courses. If courses don't adapt to those models, there'll be fewer people willing to invest the level of energy and expense that they require. But also, it's an immoral act, as far as I'm concerned, to promise people that they're going to become a thing and then teach them something different, and for them not to, saddled with a lifetime of debt. So I think financial is a big one. Reputational, I think the student experience is a big risk. But risks are one end of the telescope. I think the other end is to look at opportunities. And I think the institutions, and there are some that are responding to this well, are those that are able to really integrate effectively a broad curriculum that gives the space for students to respond to the brief in the way in which suits their particular aptitudes and interests, with sufficient flexibility that for those students that came from my background, which was very much more about the a kind of practical experimentation, the equipment, the process, and discovery through doing, they've got that space. And just as important are those theoretical students who would take a different perspective. I think where you've got the integration between academic, so that's probably the wrong phrase, not academic and technical. I think it's with theoretical and practical. And I think all of us have traits of the other job family. So I've got a number of academic credentials, but I've worked in technical contract. I know plenty of academic staff who are very technically able. I think if we can shift ourselves to a model of, one team, we're a united team of educators, and a metaphor used in the project I was in maybe a year ago was about the university as an ecosystem. And I think that's actually quite helpful to consider. Each of us, we all have roles. We have a single mission, which is broadly around those points I raised about giving students a good experience and a better life afterwards, is to understand actually these things should be planned and integrated and costed, because those financial risks, the reputational risks, and student experience risks, I think for institutions that are able to properly integrate and respectfully integrate all that teach and support learning, and I mean that beyond academic and technical. There are academic developers, there are librarians, there are careers advisors, all those other staff in the third space that have a material impact on the student journey. I think being able to view your institution through that lens, the risks, they begin to reduce, but the opportunities hopefully expand.
That's really interesting. Thank you. It's a very eloquent description of both the risks and the opportunities. We've had a comment in the chat there around technical education has been undervalued for years, and industry is suffering as a result. And I think that absolutely plays out in all the statistics of recent years of the skills gap, ongoing skills gap. We've done a bunch of work in that area recently around work both with employers but also with institutions, and that disconnect between the fact that there's a whole bunch of people working really hard in universities to prepare students for employment, and yet for whatever reason when they hit the workplace there is still this disconnect. And I think you mentioned this sort of the mood music at the moment is very much for HE. There is an existential risk threat, but and you alluded to this within that there is a huge opportunity to almost recreate the value proposition of higher education by putting technical education at the heart of it, to say yes, higher education is still worth the investment, because it does give you the knowledge, but it also gives you the skills and the ability to hit the workplace and be absolutely workplace ready. So it does feel like if there is an opportunity at the moment to kind of rethink where the center of HE sits, and if we look at this sort of narrative towards away from knowledge and research perhaps a little bit, but more towards skills, certainly at level 3, level 4, then the opportunity for deeper integration of technical education seems to present a huge opportunity, would you say?
Yes, I absolutely think so. I think there's I don't want to downplay knowledge and scholarship.
No, not at all. No, but
completely. I think the way in which knowledge comes in different vehicles. I think if you look at a PhD in arts practice, you would, have to accept that. And I suppose it's valuing these different forms of knowledge and understanding their transferability. There's a lot of research on what I call the missing middle, which is universities preparing students to be, CEOs and disruptors and things like that. But actually, if you took a more utilitarian perspective on what a university education is, it's very often to equip students to get their first job. Which, yes, they need some of these, a breadth of different intelligences. But speaking from my own perspective, especially, what got me my first job was my ability to do things, my knowledge of, the equipment, the way in which it was used, and what good looked like. It was a marriage of, I said, that academic stuff didn't stick, but absolutely it did. It was so valuable. And actually, I didn't appreciate the value of my MA in photography until I'd long finished it and realized I was viewing images differently. So I think it is that symbiosis of the different kinds of knowledge. And if we undervalue one type, and I think there's a risk of the undervaluing, again, going back to my experience in the 90s, is there's a hierarchy of knowledge. And without getting too philosophical, but I will, Plato theorized the two forms of knowledge, the cerebral and the physical. And of course, in his book of the Republic, the cerebral realm is held in higher regard than the physical. And I think the root of that disparity of esteem could be felt from that. Do you come home with clean hands or dirty hands? And I think the physical practice over the kind of cerebral practice still has that aloofness with it that is probably more aligned to academic roles than technical roles. But my thesis talks about an oscillation between ideas in the studios and workshops aren't just about outworking ideas you've already had. They're about informing ideas. It's a loop. And you take different inputs as a student from different people, and to you it doesn't really matter what contract status they're on. You take people's advice. However, the assessment is very often academically governed, and people will lean towards that. Naturally, students do.
Yeah, it's interesting. And you mentioned earlier on this sort of hidden curriculum and this idea of what is higher education for. And I think, again, this sort of does focus on what is happening in HE at the moment, why it is having a bit of a existential crisis, and why the narrative is moving more towards skills. But this idea of the hidden curriculum is, again, something that we've ended up doing a lot of work in, and almost like not thinking so much about the discipline, certainly at level 4, and being more concerned with the project of transformation. If you're developing learners from school through higher education to their first job, that's a distinct piece of work. If you're trying to take learners through to a CEO, that's a different piece of work. But like I said, that whole missing middle, what are we actually doing, and how does that play out in curriculum design, and also then in how that curriculum is resourced and staffed? And going into knowledge too early often, I think, just does a disservice, and it often produces a lot of the problems that we see in terms of mental health and anxiety, because we're focusing too much on the discipline and not enough on the development of the person. And it does feel, again, like technical education, the technicians themselves are often right at that sort of sharp end of working with those students. They're often the first point of contact. So there is absolute value in making them more integrated into the curriculum. So I just wanted to sort of round this off, please. So what advice would you then give to senior teams regarding how to do this? Because obviously we've sort of pulled out some big ideas here around integrating technical and academic curricula, but based on your research and on your professional experience, what are some of are there any quick wins? Is there a quick way to do this, or how would you start?
Quick wins. I think that's a challenge. So I think you
quick wins.
I might not be able to give you a quick win. I tried some quick wins in my career. I suppose if I was looking for a headline, I'd say it's, let's say I'm in a senior team, a very senior team, the top 2, if you like. I think you have to have clear sight of that it's about quality and value, integration with the university's performance indicators, and effective integration with academia. So if you're looking at your technical team, you don't want a team in the shadows that behave, does things you don't know about. You don't know if you've got the right amount of technicians, if they're on the right grades, if they're effectively managed, what their performance indicators are, how much teaching they're delivered. Their contribution to learning and teaching should be front and center. there's obviously a compliance element of the traditional technical elements, whether that's running shops, stores, ensuring health and safety activities, all of those kind of things. But it really is about ensuring that from everybody who's having those contact with your students, they are on a journey of their own development in respect to their pedagogic practice. They want to be aligned to the institutional KPIs, which should also be driven by the units of study. So you've got clear knowledge of who it is, how many you've got on what course, what's the contribution of that course, how do technicians contribute, and what's the division of labour. And I think if I was going to pick out some trends, it would be about kind of stamping on that them and us, bringing those two teams together, because actually there's a lot that can be gained on both sides of the fence. GISCA consulting currently, in fact, the public consultation is closed about changes to the staff record. So it seems very clear to me coming down the tracks that there's going to be technicians will be added as a bespoke group. Not that I've got any particular insight, but they will become. In fact, that's in the consultation, so that's fine. But then the educational technical professional family being developed in the sector is a helpful model. There's research technical professional, the level of teaching qualifications that technicians have. These are metrics that are going to come in. Now, with the smoke around TEF at the moment and what that's going to do in terms of quality, being able to point at who are your qualified teachers, regardless of contract status, is going to advantage some of those institutions that might be, drifting towards the color of TEF they didn't want. There are wins that can be found there. Same for NSS. Don't just look at your technical teams as learning resources. I've done some work recently to really map the using Covey's circles of control, influence, and concern around how technical activities, learning and teaching, but also the broader spectrum of the role, impact upon all of the NSS questions, because that should be a team game. It shouldn't be, the questions about teaching at the very start. That's going to be responded to for who's teaching you. And if, a significant part of your curriculum is delivered by the technicians, then they need to be brought on board with that and developed and valued. And then it's a more holistic and accurate picture. So, points on quick wins for have a couple of minutes. I'd say visibility, making your technicians visible. So that's curriculum design, it's the workload allocation model, quality assurance, quality enhancement, new course planning, course review, QAA and advanced HE both identified technicians as critical in the TEF, which is a lesson I think I'd be listening to if I was at the top of university. Constructive alignment of your curriculum, again, making sure that the curriculum that is assessed is the curriculum is written and validated is the one that's delivered to start with, but being clear on what's in that, who's delivering it at the right time for what purpose. Value for money, another core message for the top team. Having a clear financial resource model for your people, regardless of their contract status. That starts with having clarity over your student numbers and your curriculum. That gives you a clear model of what your demand is, and then your FTE and your WAM, which then helps you understand your delivery model and makes you know whether you've got too many or not enough staff at what level, which helps you when you franchise, because otherwise you risk franchising your units to an institution over there. But if you don't tell them that it's 3/4 delivered by your technicians, it's going to fail. And that does happen. Leadership and strategy, another core area. Again, I'll come back to the point. A strategic technical lead is essential. We've seen institutions really flourish in that condition, and equally we have seen some flounder. I think value for money, I'd stand behind that. Student experience should be front and center as well, not just chasing the metrics of NSS, GOS, or what's the other one, TEF, but actually the experience people are having. Really, whether that's the pastoral element, and what something that came out of my research and also through UKRI study was around the contribution of technicians to the retention of students through those pastoral relationships formed through practice, and without those hierarchical "you're assessing my work," there was clear evidence there. I think that's something institutions struggling to make ends meet, really retention is a big piece for them. Final point, I suppose, will be the workforce development, which is there is great work being done in the sector at the moment around career and promotion pathways for technicians. I think certain institutions, Warwick, Manchester, Met, Liverpool, have done really solid work based on the Talent Commission around career pathways. And I think fundamentally it's about recognising the contribution that technicians can bring, the integration with the academic teams, paying them properly and fairly, and that will aid your retention of your technicians as well, because a big risk to some of the smaller institutions is they lose their most skilled to competition.
Yeah. Goodness, I mean, there's about 7 different podcasts in there, I think, that we can focus on each one of those. Another great question from the chat. So should we be moving more away from a concept of HE then work and looking at more of a continuous or a much sort of a smoother journey, smoother integration from HE to work? I think that's another thing to unpack. So I think there's a lot to continue talking about. I think we'll have to schedule in some more time to talk about those, because these are all, they're not necessarily quick wins, but they're all absolute wins for all stakeholders. They're wins for students, they're wins for technical staff, and they're wins for institutions. So each one of those points you've made there absolutely warrants further consideration. In the meantime, while we schedule another conversation, I mean, where can people find your research? Is it, if they want to have a look at the taxonomy, where can they find it?
Oh, okay, that's a good question. I suppose early papers, the stuff I wrote my MA, they've had a fair bit of traction. That's been quite good. So Google Scholar is a good place. I think there was one about technicians who transitioned their roles into academia. There was another about the value of HEA fellowship. But in terms of the thesis, that's available on the UCA website. It's also available on, I can't remember, somewhere else. Google it. Tim Savage, teaching to the line, how do visual arts technicians conceive their pedagogies. But it's coming to, I'm fortunate to get a kind offer from Routledge to transition my thesis into a book. So that's nearly there. So that will be coming out next year. There's another book I contributed to with Kelly Veer more recently about technicians in a broader STEM context. My chapter in there is the technicians as educators, and some of that empirical research is available in the Research England funded Talent Commission. My contribution is most visible in the technicians as educators section. And also, if for advice and support, I've transitioned my career recently and started a new venture, which is timsavageconsulting.co.uk, and that then lists some of, I've focused on risks and opportunities, but actually not every institution has the capacity and the expertise to follow a path, even if they want to. So my mode of working right now is to hopefully make some of these theories that I'm talking about a reality for institutions with the will to do so.
Well, as I said, there's nothing more practical than a good theory, and I think your thesis and your research is an absolute demonstration of that. There's plenty of practical implications that have come out of all the work you've done. So for anyone watching, recording, if you would like to find out more and interested in exploring issues around technical education and how it can absolutely add value, then do check out timsavageconsulting.co.uk and follow up with Tim. There's no one better than Tim to guide you in some of these issues and really figure out how to use this to add a lot of value to your institution. So Tim, thanks so much for joining me today.
And thank you, Tony. Thanks for the chance. It's lovely to chat.
Always.
So yeah, hope to see you again.